Russia. Winter, 1916. A man is poisoned, shot again, beaten, tossed into a frozen river, and somehow still alive. Or so the legend says. Was Grigori Rasputin truly a mystical figure with supernatural powers? Or was he just a really, really difficult man to kill? Welcome to Probably Not True, the podcast where history's weirdest, wildest, and most stubborn myths come face to face with some very awkward, very unamused facts. Today we're diving into the legend of Grigori Rasputin, Siberian mystic, healer, political meddler, and according to some, a man with more lives than a particularly vengeful cat. From the gilded halls of the Russian imperial court to the smoke-filled peasants' taverns of Siberia, Rasputin's story is soaked, absolutely marinated in blood, scandal, and enough mythology to fill a bookshelf. He's been called everything from a holy man to the devil incarnate, the healer who could soothe the ailing heir to the Russian throne, the seducer who whispered in the ear of the Tsarina, the puppet master who brought an empire to its knees, and of course, the man who refused to die, surviving poison, bullets, beatings, and a late night swim in a frozen river, if the stories are to be believed. But how much of this is historical fact? And how much is a product of panic, propaganda, and a deep, deep fear of bearded weirdos? I'm in trouble if that's the case. Was Rasputin truly the mystical figure of legend? A man with supernatural powers and an unshakable grip on the Russian royal family? Or was he just very lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you feel about being poisoned, shot again, beaten senseless and tossed into an icy river? Today on Probably Not True, we're peeling back the layers of myth, scandal and melodrama to get to the strange but very human truth about one of history's most infamous survivors. What the legend claims. The popular image of Rasputin is practically larger than life, a swirling cocktail of fear, fascination, and good old-fashioned historical exaggeration. It goes something like this. Picture a wild-eyed, scruffy, bearded holy man with hypnotic powers so intense, one glance and you'd spill all your secrets. A peasant-turned-prophet, who somehow wormed his way into the inner sanctum of the Russian royal family. A mystic, a healer, a sorcerer, depending on who's doing the gossiping, with the ability to stop the bleeding of Tsarevich Alexei, the hemophiliac heir to the Russian throne, when no doctor could. But the real cherry on Rasputin's mythological sundae is his unbelievable resistance to death. According to legend, Rasputin didn't just die, he refused. When his enemies finally decided they'd had enough, they invited him over for what we'll call a very special dinner, one laced with a massive dose of cyanide. When the poison didn't seem to faze him, they shot him. When the first bullet failed to keep him down, they shot him again. Still breathing, they beat him mercilessly. And finally, still allegedly moving, they tied him up and tossed him into an icy river, assuming surely that would do the trick. Spoiler. Even then, the legend claims that he tried to claw his way out of the frozen water before finally succumbing. Talk about commitment to the bit. In this popular version of events, Rasputin is remembered as much more than a man. He's a force of nature. A mystical, prophetic figure with supernatural healing abilities and an unholy resistance to mortal injury. Some said he was a holy man sent by God. Others were quite sure he was the devil's personal houseguest. Either way, Rasputin wasn't just influential, he was feared. A political puppet master lurking behind the throne, whispering into the ear of the Tsarina, tugging on the strings of the Romanov dynasty as it stumbled towards disaster. According to the legend, Rasputin wasn't just hard to kill, he was practically unkillable, a man gifted or cursed with powers far beyond mortal understanding. But was Rasputin really a supernatural wonder who cheated death? Or was his so-called immortality just a mix of embellishment, panic storytelling, and a lot of vodka-fueled paranoia? Stick around, because Probably Not True is about to dig into what really happened in the last, very messy night of Rasputin's life. Who was Rasputin, really? Before the poison, the bullets, and the frozen river, before he became the shaggy-haired boogeyman of Russian high society, Grigori Rasputin was in fact just a regular guy, albeit one with a knack for making an impression and a bucket load of charisma. Born in 1869 in a small mud-smeared village in Siberia, Rasputin's early life was about as far removed from the opulence of St. Petersburg as you could get. He was literate well into adulthood, more comfortable around horses and riverbanks than politics or theology. But in his 20s, something changed. Rasputin underwent what he described as a religious awakening, the kind of dramatic, soul-searching moment that usually comes after a lot of personal turmoil and not enough hygiene. He left his village and began wandering across Russia on pilgrimages, immersing himself in a strange, personal form of spirituality that didn't always line up neatly with the Orthodox Church's official teachings. Eventually, Rasputin developed a reputation as a starets, a holy man or spiritual elder. But crucially, he was not officially sanctioned by the Church, which meant that his brand of mysticism was very much a DIY project. Along the way, he cultivated a magnetic, and some would say unsettling, personality, mixing aesthetic practices like fasting and prayer with a rumoured side hobby of heavy drinking and enthusiastic womanizing. Basically, a Russian lad. Spiritual purity with occasional vodka chasers. Despite, or let's be honest, because of these contradictions, Rasputin's reputation grew, and tales of his healing powers and unsettling charisma began to reach its highest levels of Russian society. Eventually, the gossip mill delivered him to the steps of the royal palace. By the early 1900s, Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra were in a state of near-constant panic, and for good reason. The son and heir to the throne, Alexei Nikolaevich, was born with hemophilia, which was a life-threatening blood disorder that caused unstoppable bleeding even from minor injuries. To be honest, anyone who was descended from Queen Victoria suffered from this. In an era before modern medicine, this was a death sentence waiting to happen. The doctors were powerless, treatments were limited, crude and mostly ineffective, and every bruise, every fall down the stairs was a potential catastrophe. Enter Rasputin. Somehow, and the how remains a matter of debate to this day, Rasputin appeared to ease Alexei's suffering, whether through sheer force of personality, a calming presence that lowered the boy's stress and therefore blood pressure, or some rudimentary understanding of folk medicine. Rasputin's interventions seemed to work. Episodes of bleeding lessened, Alexei recovered from brushes with death that should have been fatal, and to the Tsarina, this wasn't just helpful, it was miraculous. In Rasputin, she saw divine intervention, proof that God had not abandoned her family, and as a result, Rasputin quickly became more than just a guest at court. He became a trusted advisor, a confidant, a shadowy figure whispering behind the scenes, the secret puppet master. Critics, and there were many at the time, accused him of manipulating Alexandra, using his influence to meddle in political appointments and military strategies, especially during World War I, when Nicholas II left the capital to oversee the army, leaving Alexandra, and by extension Rasputin, more or less in charge. To the Russian nobility and the already disgruntled commoners, this was intolerable. It wasn't just that Rasputin had access to the royal family now, it was that he, a barely educated peasant with suspect morals and suspicious eyes, seemed to control it. In a country teetering on the edge of a revolution, Rasputin was a symbol of everything rotten in the Romanov regime, corrupt, decadent, and dangerously out of touch. Once the rumour mill got rolling, it didn't stop, not even after Rasputin was finally and definitively very much dead. December 1916. Russia is on the brink. The Tsarist regime was gasping its last, and the nobility, never a particularly chill bunch to begin with, had decided that a bearded peasant had to go. Enter Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and a few other conspirators who figured the best way to save Russia was to murder Rasputin, because, that makes sense. The story they later told reads less like a heroic act and more like a very dark, extremely botched farce. First, they lured Rasputin to Yusupov's lavish palace with the oldest trick in the book, the promise of meeting Yusupov's glamorous wife. Once there, they fed him cakes and wine laced with cyanide, lots and lots of cyanide, I'm talking bucket loads of cyanide. And when Rasputin didn't immediately keel over like they had planned, panic began to set in. They shot him, once, point blank, right to the chest. According to the legend, Rasputin stood up, shrugged off the wound like it was nothing but a bad hangover, and staggered toward the door. So they shot him again, this time in the back. Double tap for good measure. And when that didn't seem enough, they savagely beat him, clubbing him with whatever wasn't bolted down. And finally, because apparently nothing says mission accomplished like a dramatic flourish, they tied him up and tossed him into the icy Neva River. According to the most popular version of the legend, when Rasputin's body was found days later, water was found in his lungs, suggesting that he was still alive when he hit the river, kicking and thrashing and refusing, even then, to just die. A man too tough to die, practically immortal, the ultimate final boss of Imperial Russia. What the evidence actually says. Here's where things start to unravel faster than a bad knitting project. For starters, the only real autopsy report, which was conducted by Russian medical examiners before the chaos of the revolution swallowed everything, indicates that Rasputin died from gunshot wounds. Full stop. No mention of poison, no confirmation of drowning. As for the cyanide, well, some historians suggest that the poison might not have been real at all, and if it was, it could have been neutralised. Cyanide doesn't play well with sugar, and those cyanide-laced cakes were reportedly drenched in the stuff, so Rasputin may have simply eaten a poison-proof dessert. A cake balanced out by the sugar. And let's not forget, Rasputin wasn't exactly in Olympic shape that night. He had been drinking heavily. He'd probably already arrived half drunk. Not exactly the peak condition for a poison-fueled sprint through a palace. More importantly, the source of the dramatic Rasputin the Undead narrative, Felix Yusupov himself, a man who, let's be honest, had every reason to embellish the story, wasn't just getting rid of an inconvenient figure, he was crafting a legend where he was the hero who defeated the unstoppable demonic menace. The more of the monster that Rasputin seemed, the more of a hero that Yusupov looked. Surely that's convenient. And the truth, like most things, is probably a lot less cinematic. Rasputin was shot, we know this, likely twice, and he died from those wounds. The poison, the desperate escape attempt, the drowning, the last gasp in the freezing river, all likely embellishments. The kind of details that makes for excellent gossip, thrilling headlines, and very, very bad historiography. No demonic powers, no unkillable peasant prophet, just another very mortal, very messy political murder and intrigue, albeit one that left behind one of history's most persistent of dramatic legends. Was Rasputin really a mystic? When you peel back the layers of myth, one question keeps popping up. Was Rasputin really a mystic? A man blessed, or cursed depending on who you ask, with supernatural powers? Or was he just very good at being in the right place at the right time, with the right, vaguely spiritually sounding advice? Let's start with his most famous miracle, shall we? Rasputin's apparent ability to ease the suffering of the Tsarevich, the young heir to the Russian throne and noted haemophiliac, is often trotted out as Exhibit A in the case for supernatural abilities. The boy's disease was terrifying and poorly understood at the time. Even a minor injury could lead to unstoppable internal bleeding. Traditional doctors, with all the leeches in the world and good old-fashioned ignorance, were largely helpless. And sometimes this even made worse, because, draining the blood from a haemophiliac is surely only going to go well. Enter Rasputin. As it seemed miraculously, Alexei's condition would sometimes stabilise when Rasputin was around. His pain would ease, his bleeding episodes would subside, and to the desperate Romanovs, this wasn't coincidence, this was divine intervention. But modern doctors, armed with centuries of medical advancements and a few fewer leeches, suggest a much less mystical explanation. Stress and excitement can worsen bleeding episodes in haemophiliacs. Rasputin had a calming, soothing presence with the long talks, the hypnotic gaze, the reassuring words. These could have all reduced Alexei's stress level, allowing the body to recover a lot more naturally, and naturally slow down the bleeding. Also, rest, which Rasputin advised all the time, actually was excellent medical advice then. It was excellent medical advice then, and it's excellent medical advice now. I just don't get enough of it. I'm recording this at 4 a.m, for God's sake. But compared to the brutal interventions at the time, no bleeding out from a fall if you're lying still in bed. In other words, Rasputin's so-called healing powers were less about the sorcery aspect and more about actually having good bedside manner. He wasn't working miracles. He was doing what any modern doctor would recommend. Keep calm and stay in bed. Hypnotic influence. Another major thread in Rasputin's mystique was his rumoured ability to control people with his hypnotic seduction gaze and bend people to his will. Contemporary accounts describe Rasputin as having an intense charisma, the kind of raw and settling charm that made people lean in even closer, even as every instinct told them to run. Unshakable confidence. He believed that he had divine power. That kind of conviction is magnetic, especially in uncertain times. He also had a knack for telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. He knew the right words for the right situation, reassuring for the worried, promises of healing for the sick, prophecies for those who are anxious. Essentially, he was an extremely well-timed hype man. So if you combine all of that with the Romanovs' sheer desperation for hope and for salvation, for anything that might save their son and save their dynasty, and you have a perfect recipe for belief. The Tsarina wasn't just listening to Rasputin's advice, she needed it and was clinging to it like a lifeboat in a storm. No mystical powers were required, just an uncanny ability to project calm, certainty and spiritual gravitas, exactly when it was most needed in the lives of the Romanovs. In short, Rasputin didn't need the magic. He had charisma, timing and the subtle power of being the only person in the room who acted like he had all the answers, even if he definitely didn't. Fake it till you make it. And why the myth endures? It's easy to wonder, if the evidence is so clear, if Rasputin wasn't really unkillable or supernatural, then why does the myth still cling to him like cigarette smoke in an old tavern? And the simpleness of it is, Rasputin's life and death were made for legend. In a Russia that was teetering on the edge of collapse, just a few short years away from revolution and the complete dismantling of the monarchy, Rasputin was the perfect villain, the perfect scapegoat. He wasn't just some grubby peasant with a questionable beard and worse dental hygiene. He became a symbol of everything that people believe was rotten about the rule of the Romanovs. Corruption. He was seen as a parasite. He used his influence to appoint ministers and meddle in government affairs where he has no business doing. Decadence. Rumours of drunken orgies, affairs with noblewomen and nights of wild debauchery painted him as the living embodiment of moral decay. And a divine right gone to rot. The Romanovs claimed to rule by the will of God, and by having Rasputin, a man described as lecherous, manipulative and unholy and satanic, in their inner circle made a mockery of the claim that they were divine rulers. The more outrageous the stories about Rasputin became, the more useful they were. To his enemies at court, desperate to discredit the Tsarina and destabilise the royal family, they were useful to the revolutionaries, who needed a simple, monstrous face for all the failings of the monarchy. And eventually, to history itself, which is always on the lookout for a good cautionary tale, and we love one wrapped in scandal and mystery. The man was already infamous when he was alive, but in death, messy, violent and surrounded by conflicting stories, this only amplified his legend. Every embellishment and every whispered exaggeration added to the myth until Rasputin was less a man and more a mythological creature, part prophet, part monster and part immortal. And let's be honest, the truth that he was a charismatic mystic who got in way over his head just isn't as fun. History loves a larger-than-life villain, and Rasputin, whether by design or by accident, fit that bill. In the end, the Rasputin legend survives for the same reasons so many other myths do. It's messier, juicier, and a lot more entertaining than the truth. Final verdict. Was Rasputin a true mystic? No, probably not. He was charismatic, he was shrewd, he was remarkably lucky, right up until the moment that he wasn't. But at the end of the day, Rasputin was profoundly and unmistakably human. No supernatural healing powers, no immortal life force, just a man who stumbled into power at the crumbling edge of a dying empire and hung on as long as he could. His death, far from a mystical saga of divine resistance, was almost certainly much simpler and much more human affair. It was a messy, violent assassination fueled by political panic, personal grudges, and just a good old-fashioned fear of the unknown. Rasputin didn't survive poison, bullets, beatings, and frozen rivers because of magic. He didn't survive them at all. He died. Just like everyone else. It just took a few extra tries. Mystic rating, 2 out of 10 hypnotic gazes, a lot of myth, a little reality, and a whole lot of bad luck. Thank you for joining me on Probably Not True, the podcast where we put history's weirdest, wildest, and most unbelievable myths under the microscope and see how many of them survive close inspection. Spoiler alert, not many. New episodes drop every Monday, so make sure you're following if you like your history debunked with a side of dark humour. Do you want bonus episodes, exclusive content, and even more behind the scenes chaos? Check out our Patreon, link in the show notes. Support the show, get more content, buy me a coffee, and help keep the history myth-busting machine rolling. Next time on Probably Not True, the dancing plague of 1518, death by dance party. Yeah, it's exactly as weird as it sounds.